for being here. Mention the words Fukushima, and even now, more than 3 years later, images of that disaster in Japan remain vivid. The horrific tsunami sweeping in from the ocean, carrying vehicles and houses like toys. The long-distance camera shots of reactor buildings exploding in columns of white smoke. Footage of helicopter pilots bravely flying over plants, trying unsuccessfully to dump water into the sizzling reactor buildings. The photographs of young children being screened for radiation exposure, and of families crowded into makeshift shelters. Communities now transformed into ghost towns, frozen in time. Never before has the world watched a nuclear disaster unfold. We can only imagine the chaos that reigned inside the battered Fukushima Daiichi plant, the heroic actions of workers who were called upon to respond to events none of them had ever trained for or even thought possible. We can only imagine the despair and fear of those living near the reactors, people who fled with only the clothes on their backs, leaving their beloved pets and farm animals, abandoning possessions and the communities that they had lived in for centuries. Today, the government refers to these communities as difficult to return zones. In reality, they may be never to return zones. Here's what we did see. Authorities charged with protecting public health and safety, spouting calm reassurances to the Japanese people and to the world when the situation was deteriorating by the hour. From the beginning, those reassurances rang hollow. It'll be years before anybody really knows what actually happened inside that plant. And as the ongoing news reports clearly indicate, this is a crisis that is far from over. Decades from now, they'll still be cleaning up Fukushima Daiichi. Some estimate the price tag of the accident will hit a staggering $250 billion. Fukushima Daiichi had 6 reactors, 3 of which were operating on March 11, 2011. The plant was built in a seismically active stretch of Japanese coastline. Areas to the north had been hit numerous times by tsunamis, and the plant itself was protected by a 15-foot seawall. The quake that struck at 2:46 that afternoon measured 9.0, making it one of the largest in recorded history. The reactors were designed to withstand a large magnitude earthquake, and they shut down as designed. But even when you flip an off switch on a reactor, the fuel inside remains incredibly hot, and it requires continual cooling to prevent it from overheating and melting. Those pumps require electricity to operate. Reactors produce power, but they also require electricity to run. And although the reactors survived the quake, the power lines carrying electricity to and from the plant did not. In the event that off-site electricity was lost, each reactor had 2 emergency generators to provide backup power. Those generators were stored in the basements of the reactor buildings to protect them from damage from earthquakes. That seemed a prudent move, except it failed to consider what followed a major earthquake, a tsunami. At 3:27 p.m., the first tsunami hit the seawall. It was 13 feet high and was easily deflected. Then at 3:35, the second wave struck. It towered about 50 feet, surging in and flooding the plant to a depth of about 14 feet. We all remember seeing that water. Generators and power panels were destroyed. All power to units 1 through 5 was lost. In nuclear parlance, it was a station blackout, the most serious event that could occur at a nuclear plant. Even as the tremors continued, workers scrambled to put in place their last hope for saving the reactors from overheating: batteries. Those batteries were good for just 8 hours. The clock was ticking. It's worth noting here that batteries at most U.S. reactors are good for just 4 hours. Workers struggled to get just one pump to work, all the while fearful of another earthquake or tsunami. Recall that many of these workers lived nearby, and they had no idea of the fate of their families and their communities in this horrific natural disaster. We tend to forget that there was a terrible natural disaster at the scene as well. They ranged out through the plant parking lot, scavenging car and bus batteries in a desperate attempt to power the backup systems. Just as they were about to connect the pump, the Unit 1 reactor building exploded. All of their valiant efforts were for naught. And from there, things just got worse. What we witnessed at Fukushima Daiichi in those first days was the unraveling of a myth, the myth of safety, one carefully nurtured over the years by the global nuclear industry, by regulators, and by those with an economic interest in promoting nuclear power. For decades, the prevailing attitude within this exclusive community has been that the probability of severe accidents is so low that it's not worth the time and the money to protect them. You might ask the Japanese public if they would agree with that today. Nuclear reactors are robust. They are built to withstand a variety of mishaps, but there are limits to those mishaps. And those limits do not come close to the events that took place at Fukushima Daiichi. Certain events were deemed too improbable to be factored into reactor design, operator training, or emergency planning. Yes, there were backup safety measures, but they too had limits. The chance that all of the safety barriers would fall was never part of the planning. Everyone was confident that accidents would follow a certain script. On March 11, 2011, Fukushima Daiichi went wildly off script. Nobody worried that a 1-2 punch of massive earthquake and tsunami could hit a nuclear plant. Not even one built in a seismically active part of the world and perched along a low spot on the Pacific Ocean. Nobody thought multiple reactors might lose power simultaneously and that backup equipment would be destroyed, making it impossible to cool the fuel inside and to vent radioactive gases now building to dangerous levels. Nobody thought that it would require more than just a few hours to restore vital power, that backup power systems would be destroyed, that batteries would be quickly exhausted, that even basic communications would be lost. Workers had just 8 hours to get things working. It was 9 days before off-site power was restored at the plant. Nobody thought that an accident at a nuclear plant could cause so many systems to fail. Nobody thought to factor in uncertainty. The safety bar was set at X. Nobody asked, what if X plus 1 happens? Most of the debate about nuclear safety over the years has been conducted in hypothetical terms, the stuff of computer modeling and risk assessments. There was nothing hypothetical about what was happening at Fukushima. Suddenly, all the neatly designed accident scenarios rendered in the computer models and the risk assessment formulas were of no value to anyone. I came to this project as a storyteller, drawn to a saga of immense drama. I'm a journalist. I was asked to join with the two nuclear safety experts at the Union of Concerned Scientists with whom I had had long-term dealings as a writer. David Lochbaum, a nuclear engineer, and Ed Lyman, a nuclear physicist. It took me about 30 seconds to agree to do this. And it was a project that took us about 2 years to do, but it was well worth every minute. This was a technological disaster, but it was a story with a human face and very real human consequences. We write that there often was a total disconnect between what was happening at Fukushima Daiichi and how the government and the utility officials in Tokyo were responding. That only compounded the crisis at the plant. Here's an example. On the afternoon of March the 12th, the need to get cooling water into Unit 1 became critical, and Plant Superintendent Masao Yoshida ordered his men to start injecting seawater into the unit in a race against the clock. Even as they were struggling to get water to cool the damaged core, officials back in Tokyo were dithering. Yoshida was told by his bosses in the capital to suspend the injection effort pending further discussions among government officials. But Yoshida, who truly is a hero, knew that if he did stop, he might never get the jury-rigged pumping system to work again. In what we describe as, quote, a moment of bare-knuckled defiance in a culture that does not reward disobedience, Yoshida called over the person in charge of the injection work and whispered some instructions. Ignore what I'm about to say. In a voice loud enough that all the Monday morning quarterbacks in Tokyo could hear via a video conferencing system, Yoshida ordered a halt to the pumping. It took more than an hour before Yoshida finally got the official go-ahead to resume. But of course, the pumping had never stopped. Even so, it was too late. The core had started to melt hours before. These were human beings caught up in a disaster the world has never experienced. A portion of our story about the accident is told through the lens of the response within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There are obvious reasons for that. One, all the information was in English. The NRC released literally thousands of pages of transcripts, emails, and other documents in the aftermath of the accident, creating an exquisite timeline and a huge trove of information for our tale. But I chose to tell the story in this fashion for another reason. The men and women of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are charged with protecting the American people from a nuclear mishap, and they were flummoxed. They had never trained for such an event. They had never imagined that one day they'd wake up to a station blackout among multiple reactors. It was happening halfway around the world, but it could very well have been at a U.S. reactor just a few miles from where they were sitting. Here's an excerpt from the book describing the scene inside NRC headquarters, which are known as White Flint. In the first hours, as staffers struggled to learn what was happening in Japan. Details were arriving from a variety of sources. Most of the news was secondhand. Japan's Asahi Shimbun was reporting that a state of emergency had been declared and evacuations were planned. CNN reported that radiation levels were increasing. On the other hand, Reuters quoted the World Nuclear Association in London, an industry trade group, as stating that the situation in Japan was under control. Among NRC members across the agency, emails were flying furiously as they combed the web and TV networks for information, sharing their finds with each other and struggling to put sometimes conflicting pieces together. Soon, however, those pieces appeared to add up to an ominous accident, as their emails reveal. 9:21 a.m. We are safe and lucky this time. 9:42 a.m. My understanding is that this is a station blackout, and if they don't get some kind of power back, it's only a matter of time before core damage. This is a really big deal. More details were shared and analyzed from a distance of nearly 7,000 miles. Within minutes of the early morning press briefings in Tokyo announcing plans to vent radiation, the implications of that decision were obvious at White Flint. 3:07 p.m. This may get really ugly in the next few days. The book also follows events unfolding inside the Fukushima Daiichi plant, at the Emergency Operations Center of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, and within the Prime Minister's offices. But it was the struggle inside the NRC to grasp what was going on and how best to respond that drives a lot of our narrative. About 160,000 Americans were in Japan in March 2011. And the NRC, along with U.S. Embassy personnel and national security officials, were responsible for protecting them and getting them out of Japan if the need arose. As the situation worsened, fears grew that the radiation might reach the west coast of the United States, threatening populations there. Indeed, we report in the book that even as the White House was telling Americans in this country they were not at risk, experts were meeting downstairs in the Situation Room, analyzing data that did indicate a possible threat of radiation, especially if the Unit 4 spent fuel pool ignited. Caught in the middle of all this was one of my favorite characters in the book, Chuck Casto. Casto was a senior official in the Atlanta Regional Office of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, with expertise in boiling water reactor design, the kind at Fukushima, who was bundled on a plane and sent to Tokyo. He arrived wearing what he called disaster casual, polo shirts and khakis, not suitable attire in Japan, not even during a nuclear disaster. He had his wife FedEx him all his suits. Casto was charged with leading the U.S. nuclear team, and he was pulled 6 ways to Sunday, especially on the issue of evacuating Americans in Japan. Here's how we describe it. For U.S. officials, the evacuation decision was a delicate balancing act. On March 13th, Ambassador John Roos had put out a press release telling Americans in Japan to, quote, follow the instructions of Japanese civil defense authorities, who were evacuating only a 12.4-mile zone around Fukushima. Now the ambassador was getting information that suggested the advice might not be sufficient. Yet if the United States were to unilaterally launch a wider evacuation, it could anger an important ally. Within the embassy itself, fears were high. When Casto made trips to the cafeteria, he was often stopped by staff members, including pregnant employees, worried about their unborn children, asking, how bad is it? there was a significant concern, he recalled. To arrive at a unified recommendation for Ambassador Roos, a high-level phone conference was arranged with naval reactors and the NRC teams in Japan and White Flint. During the call, NRC Chairman Gregory Yatsko asked, "Do we think this is going to get better or get worse?" Marty Virgilio, a senior NRC executive, responded, "It's going to get worse if you think about the spent fuel pools. Right now, Unit 4 doesn't have a spent fuel pool anymore. Water levels couldn't be maintained in the Units 1, 2, and 3 fuel pools," he added. At worst, Yatsko summarized, the accident could involve 3 reactors out of control, and possibly up to 6 spent fuel pools. The ambassador should base any evacuation decision on that information, he said, and then asked, "Does anybody disagree with that?" "Chairman," said Admiral Kirkland Donald of Naval Reactors, "I agree with you. If this happened in the U.S., added Bill Borchardt, the NRC's executive director, and a veteran of the U.S. Nuclear Navy, we would go out to 50 miles. That would be our evacuation recommendation." It was about 6:30 a.m. Wednesday, March 16th. It was time to call the White House. This was not a Japanese nuclear accident, but a nuclear accident that just happened to have occurred in Japan. Could a similar event happen here? The probability is low, but it's not zero. The question that looms large in the wake of Fukushima is this: how safe is safe enough when it comes to nuclear power? To date, the public has largely been left out of that debate. As neighbors of the Seabrook reactor, this doesn't come as news to many of you. About 40% of Americans live within 50 miles of a nuclear plant. That's about 120 million people. To me, that fact alone makes the issues that we raise in this book essential reading. Keep these things in mind. There are 23 reactors in the U.S. of a similar design to those at Fukushima Daiichi. Japanese safety regulations are not that much different than those in the U.S. In fact, the Japanese took their lead from the U.S. in setting many of their standards. As conditions worsened at Fukushima Daiichi, the NRC recommended the evacuation of all Americans within a 50-mile radius of the plant, as we just heard, fearing that prevailing winds would carry radiation far beyond the much smaller evacuation zones set by the Japanese. Although the NRC took heat for that call, it was the right one. High levels of radiation blew more than 30 miles to the northwest of the plant. Sadly, many Japanese had fled to that area, believing the Japanese government's assurances that they would be safe. A month ago, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission denied a request from public interest groups to expand the existing emergency planning zones in the U.S. from 10 to 25 miles to create a new zone 25 to 50 miles around a nuclear plant, and to require that existing biennial training exercises include concurrent natural disasters. In other words, realistic conditions. The NRC said that existing zones are appropriate and that emergency plans provide adequate levels of protection of public health and safety. The zones can be expanded in a timely fashion if needed, the NRC said in rendering its decision. Consider the Indian Point reactor north of New York City. 20 million people live within 50 miles. Think you could quickly move them if need be? Or what about the beaches of New Hampshire and Maine on an August weekend if something happened at Seabrook? Japanese and U.S. regulators share the same mindset, that nuclear power is safe and that the threat of severe accidents is so low It need not be factored into design, regulations, or planning. A tortuous logic flourishes within the NRC, which has always been reluctant to take actions that could call into question its previous judgments that nuclear plants were adequately safe. If it were to require new plants to meet a higher safety standard than old plants, the public might no longer accept having an old one nearby. In other words, the NRC can't require safety reactors because the current ones are safe enough. If that attitude prevailed in the auto industry, for example, we'd still all be driving around without seatbelts. Nuclear reactors are required to provide adequate protection, in quotes, a standard that is vague and hardly very reassuring. Like beauty, adequate protection is in the eye of the beholder. And from day one, the nuclear industry has exercised enormous sway over the NRC on safety decisions. Cost factors routinely trump tougher standards. And with increasing frequency, the people holding the purse strings, the utilities, not government regulators or officials, are the ones making the decisions on what needs to be done or not. U.S. nuclear plants are not much better equipped than Japanese plants to cope with severe accidents. U.S. nuclear plants are vulnerable to catastrophic natural disasters, multiple system failures, and terrorist attacks. Yet the NRC has been extremely slow in responding to these threats. For example, 34 reactors at 20 sites around the United States are located downstream from large dams. A failure of one of those dams could create a surge of water that could wipe out electrical systems and make cooling impossible. One plant at particular risk is the 3-unit Oconee facility in South Carolina, where the failure of an upstream dam would send a wall of water into the plant, destroying all power systems, just as happened at Fukushima. The NRC has been aware of this threat since 1996, but has not yet required the owner of Oconee to make any safety improvements. More than 1.4 million people live within 50 miles of Oconee. Fire represents the greatest threat to nuclear plants. In 1975, a fire at the Browns Ferry plant in Alabama damaged electrical cables. Emergency cooling systems at one reactor shut down, along with most of the emergency systems of the other reactor. In 1980, the NRC adopted fire protection regulations to prevent another Browns Ferry accident, and updated those regulations again in 2004. But today, about half the reactors in the United States don't comply with either the 1980 or the 2004 regulation, including Browns Ferry. It's been over 30 years since a reactor in the United States melted down. That's TMI. As a result, some believe that all the safety problems have been addressed and that no challenges remain. That's not mission accomplished, it's just plain luck. The Japanese thought the same thing until their luck ran out. Nuclear energy is an unforgiving technology, and the consequences of a mistake can be catastrophic. As Dave Lochbaum, one of my 2 collaborators, wrote, you can't have a bad day at a nuclear plant. So what has been the response of the NRC to the Fukushima accident 3 years ago? Well, the NRC has ordered better instrumentation to be installed in the fuel pools at boiling water reactors. U.S. spent fuel pools typically contain 5 times as much fuel as was in the Unit 4 spent fuel pool at Fukushima that was really at one point during the disaster considered the seminal problem at the entire plant. And thus, the U.S. pools pose far greater threats if cooling is lost. The NRC has asked nuclear plant owners to re-examine their emergency preparedness. It has asked nuclear plant owners to conduct detailed inspections of their seismic and flooding protection features. Recently, owners of at least 24 nuclear reactors around the United States, including Indian Point 2 and Pilgrim in Massachusetts, informed the NRC that they can't show that their reactors could withstand the most severe earthquake that new geologic revised estimates show they very well might face. The NRC says that continued operation of the reactors is safe until all these reanalyses are completed. That'll take years. And the NRC has willingly allowed the nuclear industry to take the lead on stockpiling portable backup equipment, but it is not required that the equipment be able to withstand just the kind of emergency that might require its use. Specifically, the backup generators that might be needed in an earthquake are not certified to withstand earthquakes. They're the kind that you and I go out and buy at Home Depot. What the NRC has not done is to heed the recommendation of its own senior staff to reevaluate the regulatory framework in place now, from top to bottom, to eliminate the patchwork of rules and voluntary guidelines that now spell out safety standards. Fix the holes in the safety net was their recommendation. That should be priority number one. But when the 5 commissioners were presented with that proposal from their own experts, not long after Fukushima, the majority rejected it, saying the current system of regulation is broken. There's no need to fix it. Priority 1 was pushed to the back burner, or as we note in the book, maybe completely off the stove. Fukushima, the story of a nuclear disaster, is not an anti-nuclear book. Nuclear power does offer a viable alternative to fossil fuels. When it runs well, it runs well. But nuclear power is an unforgiving technology, and the consequences of a mistake can be catastrophic. The book argues that if nuclear power is to remain a part of our energy mix, it must prove to the American public that it's safe, and it comes nowhere close to doing that now. As I grappled with how to wrap up the book, the perfect ending fell in my lap. It took place on the 2nd anniversary of the Fukushima accident, during an annual gathering hosted by the NRC for the nuclear industry. Near the end of that conference, a panel was speaking on a range of subjects, and the mood was very upbeat. But amid the camaraderie, one member of the panel seemed impatient to deliver a message to the audience. When it came to addressing the overarching lessons of Fukushima, for regulators and industry people alike, he brought unique credentials to the task. The speaker was the NRC's own Chuck Casto, who had arrived in Japan in the first chaotic days of the accident and remained there for almost a year as an advisor. Now, as the conference wound to a close, Casto was eager to offer some words of advice. The public does not understand the NRC's underlying safety philosophy of, quote, adequate protection, he cautioned. They want to see us charging out there making things safer and safer, to be pro-safety. If this degree is safe, a little bit more is more safe, he told his audience. A short time later, his voice filling with emotion, Casto spoke of the brave operators at Fukushima, whom he called an incredible set of heroes. This industry, over its 50-some years, has had a lot of heroes, he continued. He spoke about Browns Ferry, 3 Mile Island, and Chernobyl. Those and other events, Casto told his audience, make the way forward clear. We honor and we respect the heroes that we've had in this industry over 50 years, but we don't want any more. We have to put processes and procedures and equipment and regulators. We have to have processes and procedures and equipment and regulators that don't put people in a position where they have to take heroic action to protect the health and safety of the public, Casto said. What we really have to work on is no more heroes. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions if anybody has any. Yes.
Are there graphs or photographs, or is it illustrated in any manner?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
The book, she was wondering if the book were illustrated in any manner with photographs or graphs or
Yes. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. Yes, there are some photographs. There are some diagrams, maps, a terrific glossary. We worked hard on the glossary, and which you need with nuclear stuff, as you all know. Yes.
It may burst the format of your book, but allow me to ask a question, because I have many friends all over Japan. I would like to know, how far has the danger spread? I mean, we heard that in Tokyo the sidewalks shifted. GPS no longer worked because the axis of the earth had shifted. Children were being fed milk and water that was contaminated. Is it true, for example, that we should not be drinking Japanese tea?
I'm not a physicist. Ed Lyman, one of my co-authors, is a physicist.
Yeah.
Answer on the Japanese tea, I don't know an answer to that. The concern about fish, for example, that whole fishing area around the plant was a very big commercial zone, and that really has been destroyed. And when that will ever return is unknown. Farther away, the problems have somewhat dissipated, although there is a continuing buildup, the bioaccumulation in certain types of fish. I'm only repeating what Ed has said in another question and answer like this. He feels that, for example, the risks of contaminated water milk are long since gone. The half-lives are over. That's not something. Now, there will be several thousand additional cancers, and probably most notably among children with thyroid cancer, which is very unusual and very easy to monitor and track. So that isn't exactly on your question. That's really beyond my area of expertise. But a number of people have asked, is it safe to eat fish from the west coast of the United States? Yes, he said that the Pacific is a very large body of water, and that the dilution will create, the dispersal will create enough benefit that the fish. He said, would he eat fish from Japan? No. So that was, I'm paraphrasing him, but that was basically his line. Yeah. Any other?
With regard to that, a few months ago, well, it was quite a few months ago, maybe last fall, I can't remember when it was, but there was an announcement about how the radioactive water from Fukushima had reached the west coast. I don't know how radioactive it was, but there was concern about it, as I recall.
Well, I'm not. Again, this is beyond my level of expertise. The ability to detect radiation can go to such a tiny level, and there was a slight increase, well below the EPA thresholds for posing hazard. It's more a matter of our ability to detect even low levels of radiation rather than impending, an onslaught of something high. So I remember reading about that, but I also remember reading from the researchers at Woods Hole are doing a phenomenal job over there, and I believe that they had also mentioned that this was just a minute blip up. Any radiation is bad, but I don't think that it was a public health threat. At least I got no sense from any reputable source.
There's two things. There's, of course, radioactive water moving over, but also the air, and within days they were measuring it around the world, basically.
Well, and that stuff floats. That'll
States.
float around and float around and float.
Yeah.
I mean, the stuff from Chernobyl is still floating around.
Yes.
So, and the counter response is, well, if you flew to Denver, you'd get more radiation. Well, yeah, I have a choice of whether I fly to Denver, but I don't have a choice of whether I'm exposed to that airborne radiation. Yeah.
Again, forgive me if it's an inappropriate question, but some of us are members of the Seacoast Energy Pollution League. Herb is the president. 2 years ago, Sapple showed a whole series of documentaries regarding nuclear safety, including a most horrifying film about children born to mothers around Chernobyl who have the most unspeakable malformations. If some of the refugees from Fukushima ran north and were overtaken by the nuclear cloud, I wonder if there's any information about babies being born in that group of people.
None that I have seen. Now, again, this
Yeah.
takes a fairly long period of time. That didn't show up in Chernobyl for a while either, you'll recall. But the sad thing is that these poor refugees fled thinking that they were safe, and in fact they were right in the plume.
Yes.
And I mean, it shows how illogical this idea of a concentric 10-mile circle can be drawn with no appreciation for the wind changing. Right. And so these people, and they were up there for a month before somebody looked and said, holy moly, we've got radiation here. And one of there was a story in the New York Times about one of their reporters had gone out, and there were farmers working in their fields and tending their crops and stuff, and some inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency come, and they're in full radiation suits monitoring the radiation, and these poor farmers are looking around, what's going on? And the realization was that the radiation levels there were quite high, and only then were the people moved. And they'd been outside, so it is the long-term consequences of this will take forever, to monitor. And the other interesting thing about the book, I think, is that we raise the point that in all of the nuclear safety discussions, the long-term social and environmental consequences have never been factored into this, this cost-benefit analysis. So the Fukushima has pointed out the incredible imbalance here, when even in this foolish effort of cost-benefit, you're discounting some of the most enormous long-term costs.
That's that sort of imbalance between the costs and the consequences was recognized in 1975 when the Price-Anderson Act was passed.
Right.
Because that absolutely took most of the responsibility for the damages away from the nuclear industry, put it on the American public through the taxpayers. Right now, the fund, and I may have the figures a little wrong, but I think it's on the order of $12 billion in escrow to cover consequences of damages, and you talked about $250 billion at Fukushima. So, you know, the insurance industry gets it right. They know that there are too high risks
Right.
for this industry. If the Price-Anderson Act hadn't been passed, there would never be a nuclear industry.
Well, Dave Lochbaum has a great line, and he said that if the owner of a nuclear power plant had to go over to State Farm to get an insurance policy, we'd have no nuclear plants. I think one of the saddest recent developments at Fukushima has been that the Japanese government, of course, is desperate to get people back, and they have been paying compensation to many of these people who are 3 years now been away from their homes and living on public assistance in temporary housing hundreds of miles away. And the Japanese government is about to end the compensation, giving these poor people no choice but to move back to their contaminated homes and property, or having no source of an economic livelihood. And the other sad thing is that they're going back to areas that are heavily contaminated with radiation, that have no infrastructure, have no jobs, have no ability to return to what would be a normal life. And this is just the government just wants to stop the payout of the compensation claims.
Plus the fact that it is now forbidden in Japan to write about Fukushima.
Well, it's forbidden.
Which is-
There are lots of things that are now off limits. That's right. That's true. Anyway.
I was just wondering if there was any information you wanted to obtain or people you wanted to talk to that for one reason or another you weren't able to obtain.
We didn't do a lot of work in Japan because of the language barrier. And much of our research was based on the NRC documents, as well as the numerous investigative reports that came out of Japan by independent government and utility investigations that were then translated into English. The language barrier for us was a problem. We were a real low budget operation, and so we didn't have a budget to travel to Japan and hire interpreters and do stuff like that. So it was really largely on a public record that we but it was a treasure trove, I'll tell you. There's plenty of stuff.
But UCS has a fantastic website. You might start with that.
Yeah, it is a great website. Anyway, well, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it.